Thanks for coming to hear about infrastructure. Please continue eating, but we're going to get started so we can get through our full discussion. I am Matt Grossman. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research that is formed at OSU, and we're pleased to have you with us. I wanted to make sure everyone knows that next Thursday is our annual Michigan Political Leadership Program dinner at the Lansing Center, and we hope many of you join us there. And our next forum will be on May 17th back here. And then for those of you that are in legislative offices, we have a staff training scheduled for May the 15th. So we're pleased to talk about infrastructure today. First is going to be Maggie Pallone, who's the Vice President at Public Sector Consultants, overseeing environment and energy practice, and was previously Deputy Director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Then we'll go directly to Eric Scorsone, who is the Director of the LSU Extension Center for Local Government Finance and Policy, a professor of agriculture, food, and resource economics, and a longtime active player in local government public finance in Michigan. And then we'll hear from Beverly Watts of the Michigan Infrastructure Council, who before being appointed there also served as Wayne County's Director of Public Services. And then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So Maggie, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for being here today. So I'm going to mostly talk about roads and a little bit of water before I hand it over to Eric to really dive into those topics. But first, maybe just want to give everybody a little bit of orientation about two different significant reports that kind of are the guiding light here in Michigan as we talk about infrastructure and the state of our infrastructure. The first one being the 2018 report card on Michigan infrastructure put out by the Society of Civil Engineers. It hasn't been updated since 2018, but you can see here, I know it's a little bit small, generally Michigan's infrastructure didn't score that great, right? An overall D-, and particularly when we look at water and roads, not great at all. And then in 2016, Governor Snyder commissioned the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission report, and that for the last 8 or so years has kind of been the reference point as we talk about infrastructure here in the state. So the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission, as I said, commissioned by Governor Snyder, and it really looked at what it would take for Michigan to develop a long-term vision for Michigan's infrastructure, and then what are the policy recommendations that could be associated with that. And it looked at communications, energy, transportation, and water. I'm not going to go through all of these recommendations, but I think it helps set the stage for kind of the conversation that's occurred over the last 8 years and why I'm sitting up here today. So one of the most important recommendations was the development of the Michigan Infrastructure Council. Obviously that recommendation was implemented because Beverly is on it. So check that one happened. But additionally, obviously there was recommendations around making Michigan's infrastructure just smarter, using an asset management approach to how we think about infrastructure, and that resulted in the creation of the TAMSI and the WAMSI, both the Transportation Asset Management Council and the Water Asset Management Council, that are doing work around asset management planning and how we look at our infrastructure across assets and not just in individual silos. Investing in broadband, securing and investing Michigan's cyber security ecosystem, looking at generation capacity and transmission capacity and energy, really looking at what's happening in the UP around energy supply concerns, and that was, as you remember, coming in the wake of that really cold snap that caused a lot of energy issues up in the UP. Achieve 30% clean energy by 2035, and then here are these last two where I'm going to really spend my time reviewing transportation funding options to increase transportation investments by $2.2 billion annually. And I want you to remember that number because that was a 2016 number, and what I'm going to talk about today is a report that we commissioned by the Michigan Infrastructure and Transportation Association Commission this year that revises that number pretty significantly. Obviously working with Congress to approve the SULACs, that work is ongoing, and then really looking at how we can invest and modernize our local and private water infrastructure to ensure clean, safe water, right? This is also in the wake of the Flint water crisis, and so there was a huge focus on what do we need to do to really improve our local water utilities. So here's what the 2016 Infrastructure Commission put out in terms of investment gaps, and you can see in transportation, it was $2.7 billion. There's some other things built into there, that's why that number is different than the number I gave you. About $1 billion in water, about $70 million in communication, and then it was not a state number that they put on energy because that's $40 right, approved through the public service commission. This is a really, I'm sure it's pretty small up there and a lot to see, but I just wanted to show that also within that report, there was a whole bunch of recommendations or ways in which we could raise potential revenue. So this is not a new conversation, right? Even before 2016, people were talking about how much it would actually cost to make a 21st century infrastructure here in Michigan. Some of these have been thought out more in the legislature. Some of them have been in front of voters. Some of them have been approved by voters, and some of them have been approved by the legislature. Some of them have yet to have been acted on. So in 2023, just in the last month, PSC put out a new report commissioned by the Michigan Infrastructure Transportation Association that asked us to update the number in the 2016 Infrastructure Commission report to really look at what would be the cost to maintain Michigan's road network, and look at the road funding estimates, the revenue needed, and then some options for actually raising enough revenue to close that gap. So this is just some context for you here. We have a goal in Michigan to maintain our federal and state road system and local system to a 90% good or fair condition. That's that red line that you see at the top of the screen. You can see the historic condition that we met in that little spot there that we got over the 90% was the last time we had a significant bond issue. And then you can see here the projections. And this is based on current funding in our roads. So by 2032, not that far from here, the projection is that less than half of our highway system will be in good or fair condition. I think it's important to understand how we think about our pavement and the pavement life cycle of our roads. So the maroon line that you see here is the design life of build, right? If you're gonna build a road today and not do any additional work on the road, it can get you 20 to 25 years. And what we looked at and what the legislature has asked MDOT to look at is what would it look like to really improve and extend the life of our road to a 50-year road. And so that's what this pavement life cycle model shows you, how you can make investments as the road condition declines to continue to drive out the life of the road. So these CMPs here are smaller investments, and then obviously at some point you'll have to do a larger investment. But really, if you can do the right mix of fixes at the right time, you can take that road from a 25-year design life to a 50-year design life. So we start thinking about, okay, what does that cost? The grayed out area on the top is the cost to maintain federal aid roads. So those are like your major highway systems, your US, your significant highways in the state. And then the non-federal aid roads, your local roads, is the white area there. And so the first line is really the average road cost per lane mile. And obviously prevention costs less. That shouldn't surprise any of you. But pretty significant difference between doing a little preventative work versus even just doing some rehabilitative work or having to completely reconstruct that road, which is over $3 million per lane mile on federal aid roads. And then as you look at local roads, that number goes from 21,000 to 402,000. So PSC took that number and said, okay, what's the total cost to maintain a lane mile, either of a federal or non-federal aid road, over 50 miles? So if we do the right mix of fixes at the right time, how much would that cost us to take that road from 25 years design life to a 50-year design life? And that's where those arrows are pointing there. So you can see that cost over the life of the road, that 50 years, about $4 million for a federal aid road and around $500,000 for a non-federal aid road. And then broke that down to an average annual cost and then just multiplied it by the number of lane miles. So we maintain about 83,000 federal aid lane miles and 165 non-federal lane aid miles. And that adds up to a cost of $9 billion a year. Just simple math gets you to $9 billion. Here's how much money we're investing in roads today. About $4.3 billion through MDOT, state and federal funds, estimated through 2034. These are an annualized number. And then people have been talking a lot about all the additional money that's coming in from different federal sources. That's about $764 million, which gives us a deficit of $3.9 billion annually, even with additional money coming into the state. $3.9 billion. Remember I told you just 8 years ago, we said that number was $2.2 billion? So some pretty significant changes just over 8 years. You can see here, this equates to an annual cost of about $535 for all adults here in Michigan. So we just didn't want to say, here's the problem, and that gave anybody any solutions to fix it. So we did put out 5 different funding options that you could actually do to actually figure out that gap and fund that gap. The first one would be to increase the gas tax by 74 cents. Right, you all have been around long enough to know that we've put some numbers in front of voters and they have not been super enthused about increasing the gas tax, especially not to that number. The second one, change how taxes are assessed. You'd still have to increase the gas tax, but you could actually charge it on a per dollar instead of a per gallon basis. So in times of high gas prices, you could bring in more money. Obviously, the opposite would be true in times of low gas prices. The next option would be to increase the sales tax by 3 percentage points, so 3 cents, and then dedicate that all to roads. That could fill the whole gap. You could also allow local communities to pursue local sales tax and dedicate that additional revenue to roads. About half the states allow something like that to occur and have some mechanism in place to raise money for local roads. The fifth option that PSC looked at was to assess what would end up being about 5 cents per mile traveled for vehicles. That's commonly known as a BMT. Additionally, while PSC didn't look at it, I want to point out that there's other reports out there right now that are looking at the feasibility of tolling on Michigan highways. So that's the sixth option that I think people are obviously talking about right now. So 16 states and 2 regional bodies have actually started looking at putting a BMT into place. And so these are the states that as of the end of 2022 had some sort of BMT pilot happening. So it's not a new concept. The federal government's actually funding these pilots in a lot of these states. You can see though that only one in the Midwest has started this process. And I just want to point out that the numbers that I shared with you doesn't even include inflation. So we know that inflation is incredibly high right now, but even if we look back over the last 10 years and would apply an inflationary factor, inflation could add about $1.1 billion, and that's leveled off over 10 years to the cost of operating and maintaining the road system. And I'm going to get into Eric's territory here just a little bit, so please don't ask me questions about these slides, but I just want to share with you at least what that looks like, right? Like when people say inflation's impacting things, what do we actually mean? And so here you can look at the cost of construction material across 20 years, 5 years, and even over the last year. We did some work for the Great Lakes Water Authority, so I pulled this slide just to show you what this looks like in real terms for our local utilities, right? The red line at the top is iron and steel prices, up 83% over 10 years, 89% over 5 years. Any of these numbers, right, are all up staggering amounts as you start thinking about what that looks like. Additionally, we know wages are up, right? So you start looking at why these things are driving up costs and where it's coming from. You can look at just the cost of material and then the cost to pay employers. I think this one's interesting, and this is the last slide I'll leave you with before I turn it over to Eric, is the cost increases for some of Great Lakes Water Authority projects. These are actual projects that they had put out for bid, we're in the process of doing, and over the last year, this is the cost, actual cost changes that came back to each of these projects. So 27% change, 4% change, 41, 36% changes in actual projects on the ground that these water utilities are trying to manage through. No different than road funding projects. You would see the same sort of numbers come across, that in addition to just the the amount of work that needs to happen and the amount of federal dollars that are coming into these utilities, you also then have to balance the inflationary factor and what that looks like, and it really makes these federal dollars go just a lot less than what we all, I think, had anticipated going forward. So I will hand it over to Eric, where I think is going to continue talking about some of the impacts on water utilities.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Good to see everyone this afternoon. So, yeah, I'm going to talk kind of broadly, but I also serve as an advisor to the mayor of Flint, and so I've really worked on the ground on these issues about trying to rebuild our infrastructure, finance it. One of the stories I think we should tell is that there's a lot of money, but it's very hard to get actual people and stuff to do the work. So even when you have money, getting the work done is challenging, very challenging. And this is part of what's driving inflation, quite frankly, is that the Federal Reserve has declared war against inflation, and we'll see how far they're willing to push us into potential recessionary territory to get there. It's also challenging to talk very generally because we have, if you include special district governments, road commissions, all these things, we're talking well over 2,000 entities who are doing stuff. So it's hard to generalize. You also got very small places to very large places. So that, just to be clear, there's a lot of diversity out there. But what we know for sure is local governments have endured a lot of divestment, a lot of state-based property tax limits that have limited our ability to finance and maintain this infrastructure we've built over many decades. We see that, and so that's a real part of the challenge here. We've had to defer infrastructure for a long time, so we have to catch up a lot, and even keeping up with what the advancements are going to be. These legacy costs hit local governments in both the pension area and the infrastructure area. The pension area we've tried to address. The state is doing more. In fact, right now the state is putting out more money for pensions to hopefully address more of that problem. The infrastructure problem is going to be harder because honestly we don't even know the full scale of the problem. I think with roads we have a good handle. I would argue with underground infrastructure we have much less of a good handle on what the real problem is actually. So it's all these things. It's that physical, technologically networked stuff, telecommunications, roads, power and energy, railways, water ports. You could add other things. Some people talk about infrastructure being schools, hospitals, but I'm not going to include those things. I think the definition would get too broad, quite frankly. So primarily that's kind of what I'm focusing on here, are these kinds of fundamental infrastructure elements. And I want to put this out, it's a little complicated, but it's important to understand the government owns a lot of the infrastructure. And the government has to balance out depreciation and breakdown versus investment. It's trying to balance those two things. Because that infrastructure provides a flow of services to all of us. We drive on the roads, we drink clean water, hopefully. The bad water leaves our homes. All these things we basically take for granted most of the time, except when we can't, like in Flint. Okay, and so there are times when this breaks down. But I want to get away from just that Flint story, because I think it's a bigger problem than just Flint. It's easy to focus on, oh, that was that place, and that's all we have to worry about. And it isn't really. These problems are occurring more and more. If you look around the country, water systems in particular are under a lot of stress. A lot of states are having to take over water systems. We work with a whole group around the country on this, and it's becoming more and more widespread of a problem. And how we pay for this stuff, it's primarily debt-based or government grants. Obviously, there's been a lot of money put out, but again, those workforce constraints make it very hard for governments to get the work done, especially in the time frames that the feds want. So we have $11 trillion of infrastructure in the U.S. And this is important to note. State and local governments own most of it, other than essentially power and energy. That's owned by the private sector. They own the water systems primarily. There are some private water systems, but this is primarily a government-owned thing, and mostly local government. Sewer is also almost completely government-owned, and that is, again, mostly local government. And then transportation, which is mixed between state and local government. So a lot of our infrastructure is government owned. Sometimes it's operated by a private entity in some cases, but primarily it is the government that has to figure out how to pay for this, how to maintain it. And in Michigan, that's been very challenging because we've limited the set of tools we have to do this. And we've also essentially deferred a lot of it for a long time, which makes it that much harder to fix later. So you have to do several things, I think. You have to keep up with inflation. You have to keep up with population. Not just growth, because we're not a growth state. I mean, we're just not. We have some places that grow, essentially, but for the most part, we're not a growing state. You go to places like Arizona, North Carolina, they have problems of like, I worked for the governor of Colorado when I was doing my doctorate. You know, places like that have real problems of population growth. We don't, but we have an aging population, which does impact infrastructure. You have depreciation, you have breakdown, you have climate change. I mean, just today we're seeing the effects of hot and cold. I mean, and that's not atypical for Michigan, but those climate change issues are affecting us. That rain we had a few weeks ago, I can tell you in a place like Flint, it caused all heck to break loose. Sewer backups, water mains breaking, all kinds of things happening. So these things are happening very much more common than probably they were in the past. And the other thing I didn't even add here is electric vehicles. How are we going to pay for roads when we have electric vehicles and no more gas being used, right? That's going to happen at some point probably. This just shows you across the entire country, we haven't invested in infrastructure for quite a long time actually. From the 40s to the 60s, 70s, we did a lot of investment in infrastructure. We built roads, we built water systems, a lot of that was subsidized by the government, federal government, and essentially since then we haven't done it. And so that's a national story. Michigan's probably worse than the national story, but it is a national story. We essentially have not invested in infrastructure in any real way for probably 3 or 4 decades now. Cities and villages in Michigan own most of our fixed assets, which is primarily infrastructure. Counties own some, and then townships own a little bit less. But you can see there's an ownership across all types of government. So they own this stuff. Part of the problem, though, is when they put it on their balance sheet, they put it at cost. And what that does, and I don't want to get into all the accounting, but it distorts the problem of how bad we really have it. Because that cost could have been from 20 years ago. That's clearly not the cost it's going to take to put it in now. So part of the problem is if you go to governments and you look and say, what is the state of our infrastructure? Unlike, say, our pension systems where you can get real numbers, actually, with this stuff you can't. It's very hard to know, actually, what's really going on unless you have asset management plans, unless you have, and a lot of places, quite frankly, don't yet. So we really don't know the full state of this infrastructure. I can tell you things like local roads is a huge issue. A lot of that Act 51 money is going for basic like snow plowing and things. It's not going for much road repair. So we have about $25 billion in infrastructure owned by local governments. I would argue a lot of this is not in great shape. It's the roads and bridges and water and sewer lines primarily. That's the stuff that is owned by them. So the good side is there's this paradox, as I've already talked about. We have a lot of money from ARPA, from all a number of other things. Local government fund balance is very high right now, actually, temporarily, because of these strange pandemic economics we had. But the problem is there are very serious capacity constraints to spend this money, to get the work done, to get the engineering and design. It's just the reality of where we face as a workforce issue. And then inflation, as Maggie said, is really driving costs, just incredibly high and really causing, so even if you have money, the buying power of that money is shrinking rapidly. This is a slide, this is Michigan. So construction contractor employment from 1990 to 2022. We lost a ton of jobs after the Great Recession across the board, but in this sector particularly, we lost over 20,000 jobs, and we've only recovered maybe half of those. So that's part of this workforce constraint right now. And these are not distributed evenly across the state. The problems are much more acute in some areas than others. But we have not recovered these jobs, and quite frankly, it's going to be hard to do that, I think, even in the short or medium term for sure. At the same time, local government does a lot of this work itself. Road repairs might be done by a city public works department, things like that. They've also lost huge capacity. 20,000 local government jobs are gone, and they have definitely not recovered, even close to. There's been a slight uptick in the last year or so, but basically that means the workforce, both on the private side and the public side, to do this work is simply not there at the capacity needed, especially with this infusion of the federal dollars. So again, even with the money, can you actually get the work done in the even short or medium term? Long term, that's a different story, but who knows how long we have to wait to get all this done. The other thing I'd point out is where are these people going to come from? Because our labor force rates are declining. They went from, this has been going on before the pandemic. We used to have about 2/3 of our labor force working or looking for jobs. Today that's down to 60%. That means several 100,000 fewer people looking for a job or having a job. So again, where are the people going to come from to fill these jobs? Unless they're coming from out of state, we have a serious problem in our workforce. So this slide is just to say, it isn't going to be easy for us to rebuild these workforces quickly. The people aren't there, quite frankly, at all. As Maggie showed, construction costs, this is national. There's some cities here as well. It's pretty much across the board. There are some differences regionally, but just in the last 2 years, we have 12 to 14% inflation. I don't doubt the Federal Reserve will try and get inflation down to 2%. I think it's going to be very hard. I think they're going to have to push very hard on that. And my concern is, are we looking at 1981? I mean, I was very young, but I can remember it was not a good time in Michigan. And, if they continue to push us, think about this. The Fed is doing this in the face of bank failures. We just had a big real estate firm declare bankruptcy. The whole office market issue is out there. How much occupancies are there going to be in office space post-pandemic? So my fear is inflation will be very hard to beat, and so these costs are going to likely continue to rise over the next few years. I don't think inflation is just going to magically go back to 2017 numbers or something. So again, inflation, construction costs, I think are here to stay probably. I want to end with a study because again, there's so many cities, it's very hard to tell a coherent story. So I picked my hometown Saginaw to kind of tell a story of why I think this infrastructure problem really needs to be dig in, and I hope the MIC will do more with this because I think we need to get a good handle of the public pension problems that we faced. Back in 2017, we were at a $20 billion unfunded liability. It's why Detroit went into bankruptcy. Other cities are very close to bankruptcy as well because of legacy costs. But we were able to come together in a bipartisan way and start to get some solutions moving. And some of that has been quite successful, and I think we need to do the same with infrastructure. I think it needs to be bipartisan. I think there needs to be a consensus on the problem and the real numbers behind that problem. And I think the MIC is a great venue for that kind of thing. So if you look at Saginaw, this is just an example. I mean, it says they have $120 million of assets, but they have accumulated depreciation of $90 million. Okay. So if you take that, it means their assets really aren't worth that much, actually. Particularly the infrastructure piece. It says $58 million there for infrastructure, and in that ending balance column. And if you go down, you see depreciation of $41 million. Now the problem is, again, that $58 million number is based on historical cost, not based on what it would actually cost to build this infrastructure today. And so it's really an underestimate of what probably Saginaw's real problem is. And I can tell you, because my parents still live there, if you go to Saginaw, the infrastructure is pretty bad. The water system is actually good because they've had a lot of investment in that, but the roads are awful, and a lot of the other infrastructure is pretty bad, parks and other things. So if you look at Saginaw, you say the green line is the net asset, the red line is the depreciation, and the blue line is the investment they've made. So essentially, at one level, you might say, well, they only need, say $20 million to get this, or sorry, let's say maybe $10 million to fix all their roads and get everything up to pace. But in fact, if you build in inflation and other factors, which these balance sheets don't, the real cost is probably more like 25 million minimum. And if you take Maggie's numbers for the state and you apply it to a place like Saginaw, 25 million would be as big as their entire general fund. So it's just not feasible. They're not going to do it. And again, even getting the workforce to do that work would be very challenging. So this is just an example of a place that, has some economic challenges, of course. But again, to rebuild that infrastructure is going to be extremely difficult. If we want a place like Saginaw to regrow, to redevelop, the infrastructure is going to be a real hindrance there. So my concluding thoughts are, these legacy cost issues, we built the state based first on timber and lumber, which then translated into the auto industry. We developed a massive amount of wealth over, say, a 70 to 80 year period. And then starting in the 1960s, we basically got a whole bunch of foreign competition. We started to decline from that period forward. And the problem is our policies really haven't adapted well. So what that meant was we divested local governments to address the state budget problems, and we still do that to some extent today. And that's resulted in communities that have real challenges and real problems. Local governments own and control most of this public infrastructure, and they simply haven't been able to finance their way to maintain that infrastructure. And I just want to point out, we can't rebuild for 1999, which was probably our highest, best economic year. Right, we need to rebuild for 2023 for a climate that's very different, for a population that's very different. And so I would just push the legislature to think about a bipartisan comprehensive solution that addresses these problems, very similar to what we've been able to do with pension and OPEB problems, because I think if we do that, we can have a state that's really going to move forward and have communities that people want to live in, because ultimately, that's the key, is our demographics. We're going to have to rebuild the state through demographics, ultimately, to rebuild our economy to where it should be. Thank you.
Good afternoon again. Did everyone like their lunch?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody still work? Okay, good. I am Beverly Watson. I am a member of the MIC. We're called MIC, but it's the Michigan Infrastructure Council. I was also honored to be a member of the 21st Century Commission by the previous governor that Maggie spoke of. So I was glad to be a part of that team in a very short amount of time where we were tasked with putting together some recommendations, how to improve our infrastructure for the state. So now I'm glad that I was appointed last year to be a part of MIC, because what MIC is derived and the concept came up to be now to implement some of those recommendations that came out of the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission. Of course, as everyone probably know in this room, those bills, those acts came out of in 2018, Act 23, 24, 25, where we came up with MIC, also WAMSI, Water Asset Management, and also TAMSI, Transportation Asset Management. Now this is the relationship between the three. Michigan, which is MIC, the Infrastructure Council, we're tasked with the overall, all the assets in Michigan. Whereas WAMSI is really just focused on water infrastructure, and of course TAMSI on transportation. What they would do is work on strategic plans and management for our infrastructure, and then they would report that final report up to MIC. And then together we're all going to be coming up with a strategic plan, one that everyone throughout the state can work on. A little bit of background about the MIC members. There's about 9 MIC voting members. Our chairman is John Weiss, and this is a good cross-sector of individuals on this council, and we work very well together. We have a lot of different backgrounds, whether it's utility, transportation, all the infrastructure. So we're coming together in a comprehensive way to really put together some goals and initiatives and really getting input from our stakeholders. But we are the 9 voting members on the MIC Council. Now you also have MIC non-voting members, and generally they're affiliated with the state. You have EGLE, you have DNR, you have a lot of other agencies that's affiliated from the state of Michigan with the MIC Council. Our mission, and this is important for all of us to come together with the recommendations from the 21st Century report. Our mission really is, we want to provide and define a vision for Michigan's infrastructure that will provide the foundation for public and environmental health and prosperity for the quality of life. And that is our mission. That's the foundation that will take us from our goals and then our initiatives and speaking with our stakeholders. I want to go over quickly some of the goals that we have developed, our concept, our baseline. We think there's 5 important goals that the Mid-Council should be working on for all of the agencies, local and the state and counties. Collaborate. We find that from studies, there's not enough collaboration between agencies as it relates to the infrastructure. Really, as the previous director of the largest county road agency in Wayne County, I found when I took that job that we didn't do a lot of collaboration within our own road agency. I had the planning department who did a fantastic job, but maybe didn't communicate with the design section. Design section wasn't really communicating as we should with the construction section or the permit. So we want to provide a space and make sure that first you're collaborating internally, and then we must do it regionally. Coordination. Coordination is very key. You have to have a coordination of your infrastructure, and you have to have a strategy that effectively and efficiently construct, operate, and maintain your infrastructure and your assets. Then you gotta prioritize, because again, as Eric and Maggie said, it's gonna take money and a lot of it. So you're gonna have to have a plan, and you're gonna have to prioritize how you're gonna repair and improve and maintain your infrastructure. Then you're gonna have to educate, provide accurate and trusted information to support the effective infrastructure decisions that are gonna be made. Because everything you do, you're not just doing it for your team now, you're doing it for people who come after you, and also you're doing it for the public. We gotta do more educating to the public about our infrastructure, about our plan, and about our strategies. And lastly, we need to have a plan that's gonna define how we're gonna invest in this. We gotta determine, recommend, and we gotta advocate. We wanna advocate for funding for Michigan's infrastructure to promote effective, efficient investments to achieve our outcomes. Now, before we go into our initiatives, we wanted to begin the conversation. We have 9 members and we have other voting members, but we want to involve everyone. So what we started to do when MIC was created in 2018, we started these spring, I call it spring town hall meetings or spring sessions, where we would go around and we would go to maybe 15 summits in a month period. And we would pick different cities, and we're going to keep continuing doing it until we go across the state. And what we would do is just get their feedback. We'd ask them, what are the problems, your number one problems that you're facing? A lot of them have always been common. But what we did find, and it was a little surprising, but not to myself, that everyone wanted to collaborate. Everyone needed a place that they can go to and share that information. They needed a portal. They needed something that was going to sustain their road agency as they're improving their infrastructure long after they're gone. And just, Eric said it, a lot of them are losing staff. What we're finding now is a lot of engineers, first of all, you have less people going into that industry. And second is, when they get there, they're not going to stay at an agency or anywhere 10, 15, 20 years. We call them jumpers now, hoppers. So again, as you're trying to develop and you're having this conversation, we want to find out what were they facing right now. So from those conversations, and we continue that now, matter of fact, we just kicked off this month, and it'll go all the way through. Grand Rapids is our first, city that we're going to, and it'll kick off, I think, last week, and it'll go all the way to May 11th. But from the conversations we had, with stakeholders and crisscrossing across the state, we comprised and said, these are the 4 priority initiatives we should be working on and focus on now, hearing from the other agencies. They wanted an asset management training. Eric is correct. A lot of agencies do not have an asset management. And if we're gonna do it collectively and improve our infrastructure and have the money, you gotta have a plan. Well, again, when I started as director of the county, one of my initiatives I discovered is staff was working so hard. It was like the mouse on the wheel. We were chasing fires, but they were called potholes, roads, and bridges. But they didn't have an asset management plan. The largest county road agency didn't have an asset management plan. So we tasked that. I said, let's get a consultant to come in here and help us. First, we need to know the condition of all our roads and bridges in Wayne County. We need to have a plan to tell us how we can address it. Because what we were doing is addressing the worst first, which we were spending twice, 3 times more funding. Letting the road get in that condition. No, we needed to put some of our resources in maintenance, more in maintenance to slow that down. And then we needed to devise and say, what condition we want our road in, what year, and how much would it cost? So that plan told us that. And I went to the county exec, I said, we can't not afford to have an asset management plan. Because you need to plan, our CFO needs to plan, we all need to plan. I'm gonna give you that plan. So I gave them the answer. After a whole year working with a consultant, and I'm proud to say Wayne County is working off of that asset management plan today. But we said in 10 years, we wanted all our roads and bridges to be in a 90% better condition. And then we want to know how much it costs. Well, we got the answer. It's gonna cost a little bit less than $3 billion. So of course I said, my job is done, boss, now you gotta go find the money. I gave you the plan. Well, my pay grade, but I gave you the plan and you can work off of that. So we discovered and found a lot of, speaking to stakeholders, a lot of other agencies felt the same way, that they didn't know where to go. So you have to have a plan. So Mick said, let's have a AM champion program where we can start and we can offer this free to local and county agencies where we can come in here and train them and give them all the tools they need and tell them the importance and the benefits of an asset management training plan. So we're proud to say we've started that program. We've had a lot of interest because it's free. And so that plan is going to help us as holistically everyone is trying to improve the infrastructure. Another initiative was the Dig Once program. Is anyone familiar with dig? You discover that you're digging a lot, you don't have all the resources, and you don't retain that information and that knowledge. I can't tell you how many times our contractors were starting a project and the information, if it was retained, they'll show you a room down the hall where all these old maps is filed up to the room. Who's gonna go in there and dig through the map and say, what's underground here, what's there? So we needed to, and all the agencies have the same problem. So we needed to have a program we wanted to start where everyone can house this information and everyone would know, no matter whether you have turnover or not, you can house and keep this information. It's gonna make it more efficient. So another initiative, of course, that was the DIG program. And then going back to our asset management readiness scale, now if you get the asset management plan, you need to measure that. How are you gonna measure that? Because I've always say plans are only good as you measure and you see if it's working. And that's gonna help you and let you know whether you need to tweak it or change courses. So we also came up with a readiness scale to help agencies, look at their asset management plans from a policy perspective, from people in leadership, from their planning, and then external communications. I spoke about the Dig Once program, again, the challenges. I wanted to show you how we had some challenges, and everyone said some of the challenges were, lack of a procedure, changing of the workforce, time constraints, lack of technology and resources. So what our portal solution will be, and what we're taking first is taking the lead on coordinating such a program in the portal. We want to establish a standardized and repetitive approach to the dig once, instead of digging twice, 3, 4, 5 times. We want to make it simple and we want to make it accessible. And then we also want to leverage the existing data when it's available. Have it at the ready. The last initiative, which is the most important that the MIC is undertaking, and this is going to comprise all of it, WAMSI and TAMSI, your water and your transportation and all your infrastructure, putting in our initiatives and our goal. We're going to, at the end of our mission is, and our statement is to have a 30-year integrated infrastructure strategy. And that's our goal and that's most important. What we want to do is explore the challenges, which we're doing, identify the roles and responsibilities in creating a meaningful change. Meaningful change. We want to build a culture of collaboration and data-driven decision-making throughout our industry. And building that culture, again, I can reflect on some times when I was director and a lot of times, my chief engineer would come or chief planner would come and say, such and such called, or the state called, or MDOT called, or another county called, and they want to share some information, our data on our roads and bridges. And I didn't think there was a problem with the question, but they were so, they didn't want to share their information. And I had to ask them, I said, are we still a public agency, or is this the Pentagon? Because I don't know what's secret about it. I don't know why you wouldn't want to collaborate and share that. So I think that it's meaningful, but I think that throughout the state, we probably have some of the same mentality. But if we want to improve our infrastructure, we got to first of all say we're going to work together, we're going to share the information, we're going to collaborate more. So we're going to show, and we're going to have a strategic plan, hopefully to give a guide to all the agencies around that they can work with a plan and tell them the benefits. And usually when you tell people the benefits of collaboration and sharing information, you can make it more efficiently and you can save money, and they go the aha, they get it. Another facet of our strategy will be focused again on the asset management, because we want to address not only the current challenges to improving our infrastructure, but the future, because you can't leave that out and it's changing so fast. We want to look at all our aging infrastructure. You will see in our plan, funding, sustainability, changing demands and needs, climate change. Climate change. If 80 degrees last week and today don't tell you the climate is changing, I don't know what does. So we need to address that, and we need to really look at that and have a plan strategically, because it does affect our infrastructure. We need to make it accessible, affordable, equitable, and then look at the workforce. I'm so glad Eric brought that up, because that is something that is really, everyone's looking at the money, but you better look at, do we have people with the capacity to build it and to maintain it? That's an issue. So finally, there's just majorly 3 components of our strategy. We want to address the challenges. We want to look at the opportunities. How do we overcome those constraints? And then we want to give you the strategies and how to balance those strategies. So in closing, again, the MIC is working very hard, along with Wamsey and along with Tansy and along with everyone else. We want to thank the previous governor, the current governor, and everyone in this room, the legislators. Everyone always want to say, as I go around and talk, why do our roads don't look as good as Ohio, of course, or Wisconsin or others? I said, to me, it's just like you're saying, why do my house don't look as good as my neighbor's? Well, there's a reason. You got to look at investment. Are you prioritizing? Do you have a capital plan? Because I know everyone doesn't want to see those orange barrels, but we all have to work together for a plan and a strategic plan. I know we can get there because we are Michigan. We're the best state in this country. So I believe that we will get there, but we will not get there without working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, and thank you, Eric and Maggie, for your presentations. Now it's your turn to ask questions of our presenters. And right out of the corner of my eye, Bill Hamilton could not wait to get.
I can wait. Do I need a microphone?
You?
I can talk, I can project.
No.
I don't want to be like the old crabby guy that goes to meetings and has a bunch of opinions. So this isn't a question, just a couple observations. So Maggie's laughing. So one thing that I work at the House Fiscal Agency on the transportation budget. One thing that bothers me in looking at different studies and projections of the funding shortfall is, well, 2 things. Different groups are measuring different things using different measurement tools. So the PSC a PowerPoint showed the state trunk line system pavement decay chart. I use that a lot, and it shows the decay of pavement condition on the state trunk line system. So that's one element of Michigan's transportation highway system of 615 different road agencies. So we're talking about the MDOT system. So that's one element to keep in mind. There's 614 local road agencies. So one thing, thinking about the trunk line system, and this brings to the point of priorities. So if you look at the funding shortfall presented in the PSC study and some other studies, that's all the systems, all the needs without establishing any kind of priority. So if you look at I-75 in Metro Detroit or I-94 in Metro Detroit, they have average daily traffic, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, commercial traffic. If you go to county primary roads in the thumb, many of them have average daily traffic of 100 vehicles. So this is one thing that concerns me is the inability to set priorities. So that's just one thought. Two other quick thoughts. I don't want to monopolize. So we're talking about different funding options. Because of the failure to fund this system, we have been using state general fund dollars. Over the last 10 years, we've spent $4 billion of state general fund resources on this system. It's $4 billion that can't be used for higher education, for revenue sharing. Eric talked about strengthening municipalities, but there's $4 billion that doesn't go into revenue sharing or access to health care. We're doing the same thing at the federal level. We think of the Highway Trust Fund as this dedicated source for transportation. Over the last 10 years, the federal government has put $211 billion of federal general fund in the Highway Trust Fund. A quick thing, we talk about roads and infrastructure as assets. If you're familiar with the Strong Towns movement, Google Strong Towns, he says, for the municipality, that's a liability that you're obligated to maintain. They're not assets.
And Bill, you're only speaking to the one particular aspect of infrastructure, and that being roads.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we've heard here today discussion on water and sewer. We haven't even mentioned broadband, and I know Johannes Bauer from MSU's Quello Center is here and has been working on that for a number of years as well. So keep in mind that infrastructure broadly is gray and white. It's roads, it's water and sewer, it's utilities, how we get our gas and electric, and it's also broadband. So all of these issues taken together.
So again, I didn't want to be like Mr. Krabby. One last quick point. Have I got well, one other quick thing. So the one chart showed investment in infrastructure, highways mostly, roads and bridges in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Part of that is building out a system into the suburbs. So are we responsible for maintaining the subdivision streets in Holt, Hazlitt, Okemos, that actually suck wealth out of the center cities? So again, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale. I love that website, Strong Towns. I'll get off my portable soapbox now. Thank you, Arnold.
And of course, you know, that's the reason why we've seen over the last decade a lot of municipalities, townships, counties, cities, villages having road millages to take care of those streets that Bill was talking about. And of course, when we're talking state trunk lines, we're talking about the M roads, we're talking about the interstates as well that are a certain portion of our responsibility. Does anyone, yes, sir, there we go.
If I may be permitted to think outside the box, I'm an economist, and my training focused on public goods. And what we have been talking about here is user fees as the sole source of paying for infrastructure. Well, I think that's not working. The user of a road can be a grandmother who is bedridden and depends upon the ambulance to get her to the hospital. It depends upon a consumer who depends upon my grocery store receiving goods that can be put on the shelf so that the shopper can buy it. I think that the mental image of transportation of infrastructure being user-dominated is naive. I think we need a bigger picture, a mental picture of what's going on. And I would advise, think In your list of how to pay, you never mention the general fund.
Bill's already commented that we spent how many billions in general
In
fund?
Michigan, 4 billion.
$4 billion in general fund money. So Michigan policymakers over the last decade have certainly made the decision that it can't all be user fees and have gone to the general fund to fund infrastructure, in particular, I believe, roads, bridges, water, and sewer.
Well, in addition with bonds, right? So we bond for a lot of our road infrastructure, that bond money is repaid by the general fund
No,
sometimes.
never. From the restricted funds. It comes from the bonding.
water.
Sorry, water. I'm still thinking roads.
Your road.
I'm gonna slink back, sorry.
Well, thank you, I made my
Yeah,
point.
no, yes, you did, and I think policymakers are taking that into consideration, but in consideration there too, then you have to have priorities in terms of how you're spending your general fund as well, but you certainly made the point, thank you. Yes? No.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University, the Cross. And as Arnold said, we are mainly focusing on broadband policy as one of the infrastructures. But the one thing, I had two questions actually for either one of the speakers. One is, the different infrastructures are not as independent as you described them, right? And so digital infrastructure, for example, is really connecting a lot of the dots between other infrastructures, right? I mean, your transportation infrastructure, your electricity infrastructure, all becomes way more efficient if you have the right digital infrastructure in combination with those others, or water, or sewer. And I'm wondering what is happening in the different planning procedures to really look at those synergies between the different infrastructures, right? And I completely agree with the coordination point that you made, right? I mean, there's less coordination than is needed to achieve those goals. And as much as my heart bleeds by hearing about those numbers and how Michigan is doing, I think there's also a great opportunity, because going forward you can actually leapfrog some of the traditional technologies and come up with the next generation of infrastructure technologies.
About how we connect all the, we talk about it as, water, sewer, roads, utilities, and,
Right.
but it's all really connected.
Just to give you an example, right? I mean, let's say smart grids, for example, right? You can manage your electricity system much more efficiently if you have the right digital connectivity in place. It requires sort of highly reliable, bi-directional communications, but you can really reduce your energy consumption and really run a much more efficient system. But then you need to look at those two infrastructures jointly, right, and not one by one.
Exactly, and my thoughts will always go back to, again, taking an inventory and having that plan. It goes back to that management of all those assets and getting that data. First, you gotta know, because you'd be surprised how many agencies, I can tell you're very smart in what your area, the broadband, but you'd be surprised that all of some of the agencies, they don't really know all of their assets. And even the utilities. So it's just fundamentally they're taking care of, like I said, they're taking care of the worst first, but you have to have a comprehensive to see first what do you have, and then tie that in even with the utilities. There's a lot of coordination, BTE, Consumers Energy, everyone, because we have a lot of this infrastructure that's out here and we're trying to fix it, but before you can fix anything and coordinate, you gotta know what you have, and everybody gotta work together to that to get that data.
So let me ask as a follow-up to that. A lot of that infrastructure is privately owned by the utilities, by the communications companies. How are they part of all this? Are they represented on MIC? How do you reach out to them?
Well, actually, we do have a utility representative, one or two, on the MIC council, and I hope to say that was by strategy, because we need them at the table. Because of course you cannot improve this infrastructure, even broadband, you can't do it without the utilities. They have to be at the table because it's gonna take everyone. So we do have utilities representative on the MIC council,
Yeah.
voting and non-voting members.
They have to be willing to give forth their information
They
as
have
well,
to.
which is a whole nother
Exactly,
story,
they
right?
have to. And I think this year, especially particularly DTE, they're willing. They've been in the news a lot, so. They're willing to collaborate this year, so we're grateful for that.
If I can real quick to the point, yeah, I think it's a good point. I think we have to build for a different system. I think the problem is we're often saying, let's build the system as it is right now, so we're gonna maintain that system. I'll give you the example of the Flint sewer system, which is a very bad system, quite frankly. It probably gonna cost at least 200 million to rebuild it for the actual realities of today. And that's, you know, that's money, that's a lot of money for a community like Flint. And so, because you think about energy efficiency, that sewer system was built for 200,000 people back in 1950. Now they have 80,000 people, and the technology is vastly different. So I do think the costs are actually going to be much higher, but at the same time, those one-time costs can be offset by a lot of savings over time. But somebody's going to have to help pay to get over that hurdle. And I think the state and federal governments, quite frankly, in the reality is going to be, they're going to need to have to step up and help places like Flint. And I think we should address the equity issue. For some communities in Michigan, paying for infrastructure is probably not a big problem. They have a lot of wealth, they can pay for it locally, but there's a lot of communities in the state that simply can't keep up. And so there's a lot of, let's call it environmental infrastructure inequities in our system. 1 mill in Flint raises $500,000, 1 mill in Ann Arbor raises $6 million. There's simply huge inequities in our public finance system, and it's only exacerbating these infrastructure problems. So we're gonna have to recognize that this is not everybody's on the same level playing field.
Eric?
So that's a perfect segue to my question. When are we gonna start trying to do it different? Right, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So we have built a system with inherent inefficiencies and the incapacity of our smallest units of government and our poorest units of government to do what we need them to do, but we're trying to slap Band-Aids on it and use duct tape and baling wire to make it work instead of coming up with a system that's capable of working. Why do we have every city and village responsible for their own water and sewer, for their own roads, for their other infrastructure? If we're gonna fund this stuff, we have to do it at a regional level. Why don't we put responsibility at a regional level?
It's a great question.
Let's
Yeah,
blow up the system and do it right.
I think that's a policy question, right? It's a policy-making question, right?
I think about those things sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary?
So building on your comment, Mr. Hamilton mentioned, who's gone someplace, that there are over 600 local units dealing with road repairs and road infrastructure. Do we need that many? Why do we have so many? And I know Michigan has historically been known, compared to other states, for having a lot of units of local government. We have a lot of school districts. Other states have been able to manage themselves without all of these local things. And I realize there's all kinds of political issues around doing changes, but that would be kind of the direction I would look to free up existing resources. Because we can't raise the taxes high enough to do this.
Right, and I think it'll be interesting, given the change in term limits, that we've lengthened the terms that legislators can serve now, if we won't get back into these deeper policy questions, these kinds of discussions that we used to have before term limits. And as someone who has been in this field pre-term limits and post-term limits, I think that that's long overdue, those kinds of discussions again. So again, you know, we can all ask our technical experts for, and they have put forth a number of different ideas over the course of time and presented to policymakers. I know folks like the Citizens Research Council have done the same thing, and hopefully those can come back to the table, and like I said, back to the discussion table as we figure out. You saw what on Maggie's presentation, how much funding we need just to keep pace. And you know, I always have a question about tolling, because it was my understanding years ago that there were some federal roadblocks to tolling too that were in Michigan's way. So there's a lot of ideas out there. There are a lot of discussions that need to be done, and a lot of hard decisions that need to be done. So we'll see how that happens as time goes by. Any other questions? Well, again, let's thank our speakers for today. Thank you all. Our next forum is May the 17th. Thank you.